Welcome to the Tank Podcast. I'm Tina, Tank's full-time voiceover artist. In this episode, I will be reading from Emily Segal's piece The Stars in Your Stars, taken from the autumn 2017 issue of Tank, the party issue.
Mania is understandable enough as a fiery defense. In the manic state one is immortal, and everything seems unbearably significant and connected with everything else by threads of meaning which ordinary mortals cannot perceive. Once the person begins to go high, the whole cosmos becomes a kind of hieroglyphic code which in the manic state one can suddenly read. This desperate need to find connections is usually a defense against unbearable feelings of loneliness and insignificance, and the depressive state which invariably follows is the crash that occurs when the treasure hunt runs out of energy and one finally collides with reality. Liz Green, Barriers and Boundaries, the Horoscope and the Defenses of the Personality. 1. I'd like to begin with the day my mother took me to brunch with Susan Miller, the famous astrologer. They met on a plane to Austin, where Susan Miller was going to meet her web developers. My mom, though a long-time Astrology Zone reader, had no idea who her seatmate was, and Susan Miller was demure. She said she ran a website, but only when pressed did she reveal which one. "My daughter is going to lose her mind," my mother responded. On the screen of her phone, she showed Susan Miller an image I had created with my collective, K-Hole, a photo of a girl in a bathtub, reading Susan's site Astrology Zone off an iPad in a Ziploc bag. The girl was I. The text on the iPad screen was a note, published during Hurricane Sandy, explaining why the storm had made it impossible for the site to post its November horoscopes in time. "What a beautiful painting," Susan Miller said. They made plans to have brunch when they were both back in New York. The day of our brunch, my mom and I walked across Central Park to the restaurant. I'd spent so many hours as a child staring into the restaurant from the 86th Street crosstown bus, which I took to school every morning. But I'd never been inside. It was only a few blocks away from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Can you imagine how different New York would be if the doors of the Met opened onto Central Park instead of Fifth Avenue? The Met has a phantom entrance, a set of west-facing doors in a glass facade, which could open out onto the park, yet have always been locked shut. In 1969, right past those doors, in the great lawn behind the museum, the conceptual artist Robert Barry buried 4 capsules of radioactive barium, an isotope that will be disintegrating forever. They're still disintegrating, even as you read this. Once I was sitting a few yards away from where the pills are buried, at twilight, inside the museum restaurant with my little cousin, then 13 years old. A piece of cake was imploding between us. I asked her what she called cool people. "It wasn't hipsters, was it?" "No," she said, "hipster was only for old people or middle schoolers." "I guess I'd just call them Tumblr," she concluded. She'd amassed thousands of Tumblr followers as a tween. Before giving it all up, we'd just been through the Christopher Wool show at the Guggenheim. "Is it okay if I say this is so-so?" she whispered, walking up the ramp. "Yup," I told her, and took her to the Met for a piece of cake. It's been 35 years since the case closed on from the mixed-up files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler, and the Upper East Side is long lost as a center of gravity. The global node shifted downtown, then to Brooklyn, leaving the U.S. as what? One long afternoon of the old. We see Susan Miller walking into the restaurant, slowly. She is a special kind of celebrity. A real NYC media and fashion celeb, yet she's faceless, people don't know what she looks like. She comes from a time before you knew how everyone looked and has preserved that soft focus. We see her enter this brasserie of yore. Meeting her was a gift. It's like my mom clicked into my belief system out of generosity and brought her sick talent for coincidence with her. Though my mom often read her horoscope, it was different for her than it was for me, not as serious or real. At the end of the day, She's a true Gemini, a slave to information. My mom has always believed she was famous, which made me famous by extension. I loved Susan Miller for being so tender and so classic, a seer from an ancient tradition of ailing seers. She was always writing about her health problems on her site and being delightfully personal. I also admired her as a contemporary figure who seemed to be in conflict. She was beloved in the media industry, had huge audiences on the internet, yet remained somehow hapless, not quite capable of capitalizing fully on her gifts. The design of Astrology Zone has since changed, but at the time, from the look of its deeply anachronistic quality, it seemed she was either in possession of her own personal web, or trapped in one. We all ordered provolone and herb omelettes. On the back of a napkin, as if we were founding a startup, she drew out my chart. She said she saw my potential for major notoriety in media, mentioning similar aspects in Martha Stewart and Princess Diana, which made my mother gasp. A lady who'd gone to jail and another one who'd died because the press had chased her down too fiercely. I was very flattered. We talked a lot about Susan's recent ordeal. She felt like she was under house arrest after a New York Magazine article, written by an old college classmate of mine, had attempted to debunk astrology in general and Susan's authority in particular. There was one specifically nasty line about a rhinestone ring on Susan's fat little finger. "Does this look like a fat finger to you?" Susan asked, holding it up as if to test the wind. Her theory was that the writer was phobic about the supernatural because her own mom was a hypnotist, and the writer hated her. This seemed reasonable enough to me. I asked Susan how she felt about being a figure who manages mass anxiety, fielding thousands of tweets a day about people's fears for the future. For example, in that political moment, there was a huge amount of anxiety about the leak. What were the first few days like? What were the questions? How do they get overwritten? We weren't sure at that point if Snowden was even the protagonist of the story. She explained aspects of Snowden's chart and said he wasn't going anywhere. He was going to be on the world stage for a long time. She turned out to be right. When more information comes days later, we know Snowden is indeed the protagonist. But right then, he was just a guy under house arrest in his hotel room in Hong Kong, with a do-rag on his head and a Uniqlo bag at the foot of the bed. Susan Miller and I, we were enraptured by each other. 2. Brunch over, we left and walked out onto Madison Avenue. The sun was shining. I lit a cigarette. I hadn't been with my mom on the Upper East Side in a long time. She used to buy me dried fruit focaccia after school at the bakery across the street. "Oh my fucking God," my mom said. Across the street appeared this character, an apparition, like an actress from The Witches. First you need to know about her hair, the frizzed texture of it, the unmistakable color of its blonde. The woman looked like Iggy Pop, but was an Upper East Side mom. Marjorie. I stamped my cigarette out on the grey crepe sidewalk with my robin's egg blue ballet flat and crossed the street with my mother. Immediately, we were getting the story straight on what had happened to Marjorie's daughter Olivia, and though it seemed to be a set of lies, we were privileged to receive them. "Oh girls, I've been through it," Marjorie was saying on the corner of Madison. "Everything you've read in the press is a total fabrication." Marjorie's daughter Olivia had been arrested that year for an empty replay of The Weather Underground, but with all the politics leached out, leaving only heroin and explosives in the apartment she shared with her Occupy Wall Street boyfriend on 9th Street, ironically enough, 1 block away from the one the weatherman actually blew up in 1970. "Private school terrorist blah blah blah" ran all the headlines the next day. I can't help but admire that Olivia went into labor the moment the cuffs got slapped on. That is actually an act of resistance. She was 9 months pregnant the day she got arrested. I'd once held Olivia's hand in a tattoo shop in Harvard Square. We were in high school, on a trip to Boston for Model UN. She got a black star tattooed on her wrist. Back then, she looked like a girl from a 17th century Dutch painting. Her cheeks were flushed with rose, her lips were bowed, they only bore descriptions from another age. Overall, the looks in their family had a mismatched monster's quality. Her sister Eva, my year in school, was a stark white giantess with a sheet of silver blonde hair, as if her mother had been stretched and frozen. The relationship between them did not seem like reproduction so much as replication with a flick of the wrist. A few weeks later, at my company Christmas party, an old school friend told me Olivia used to find pairs of divorced parents in the school directory. You could see them because where there was usually a single address and phone number listed for each child, there were two. She'd call one of the divorcees on one phone line, their ex on the other line, conference the two lines together and stay silent while the couple argued over who had called whom. It was only a few months after the arrest and trial that Olivia's own parents got divorced. Then Marjorie ran into my mom at a restaurant downtown. "I've been thinking about you so much, I've really been wanting to see you. Bob and I split up, I live downtown now," she said, all in a rush. As a sequel to the first run-in, I viewed the urgency and familiarity of this unexpected statement as a secret revelation of Marjorie's witchery and the recognition of a related, though not identical, witch power in my mom. By contrast, my mother viewed it as a kind of private school-related social thirst. "I don't get it, but a lot of those women really wanted to be friends with me," she said. Listening to a recording of a conversation with my mother, in her living room, in which I asked her about her beliefs about astrology and how she saw her own synchronicity experiences, I'm struck by the tone of certainty in my own voice. "Oh, I always thought it was a witch thing. On the recording, it sounds nuts. I say it like it was an established truth between us," she responds as if it were nothing of the sort. 3. The image, not actually a painting, that my mom had shown Susan on the plane was part of K-Hole's third trend report, published in early 2013, the K-Hole brand Anxiety Matrix. The image of a girl holding an expensive piece of electronic equipment just inches away from a full bathtub was meant to capture the fragile gestures consumers make at times of global crisis. It was a sketch of how people try to protect themselves against vast unknowingness. Astrology, as open-ended information about the future, as a speculative grid, is a very popular way for us to think through our uncertainty. But what happens when the crisis prevents the forecast that can see us through it? The day Astrology Zone posted its Hurricane Sandy notice was my 24th birthday. I read it in my bathrobe before going to a Russian vodka bar in Hell's Kitchen for my party. Some of my friends had walked over bridges to get there. The electricity was just starting to come back on. After being trapped in various neighborhoods, some of which were desperate and flooded, some of which were calm and quiet, the energy of coming together was potent. We were amped up, happy, manic and drunk. The mythomania of New York nightlife past can obscure its utility in the present. For a generation that grew up in an age of perma-crisis, compared to my mom, Susan, or Marjorie, who arguably entered perma-crisis as adults, everyday social life is its own form of geostrategic coping. Every party is a coordinated crisis response smiley face, we wrote. As a group, we attempted to look at consumer behavior, whether online shopping, art making or going out at night, as improvisation, in response to factors beyond our control. I love the Robert Barry piece behind the Met because it's an artwork that can never be destroyed. It's been destroying itself all along.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.